Hello, we're going to have a look at crime in the 1500s, and to begin that I want to flag up a really important change to you in ideas and perceptions of crime. Because if we look at England in 1500, what we see is that when it comes to threats to law and order and what people are afraid of when it comes to crime, we tend to see that it's this group that are causing the most problem. Nobles are rich and powerful and important men who don't always accept the authority of the law and the authority of the king. And when they don't, they can cause serious problems for the kings. Several kings in the Middle Ages were killed by nobles, for example Richard II in 1399, and sometimes they can raise armies against the kings, and that can lead to full-blown civil war. So for example the War of the Roses, which breaks out in 1455. However, nobles can also then cause problems for ordinary people, because sometimes they might lead outlaw gangs and ambush and rob ordinary people as they're travelling. Sometimes, especially during times of disruption like the War of the Roses, because they had a lot of military power, some of them were rampaging around their areas, treating people incredibly badly without anybody to control them. And there are stories about them knocking people's houses down and killing people, beating people up, stealing people's possessions. So the nobles are really seen as the group to worry about when it comes to law and order. This is an idea that would have been relatively familiar to our new ruling family of the Tudors, and particularly to Henry VII, who's also sometimes known as Henry Tudor, because he himself was a noble who challenged and defeated and killed and took over from the king. So we see this theme as we come into this new ruling dynasty and this new century. However, by the time we get to 1600, things have changed, because by 1600, ideas about crime and punishment look a lot more like this. And the kings and queens and nobles, what we would call the ruling classes, are by 1600 feeling very threatened by the threat to law and order that comes from ordinary or sometimes poor people. So rather than the nobles being the people to fear and seen as the true criminals, now it's the ordinary and the poor people who are seen as the criminals. And this is an incredibly significant change, because it's lasted all the way up to the current day. If you think about what we think about crime and punishment, we tend to associate it with poorer people targeting richer people. Crime is quite often seen as a quote-unquote lower class kind of a thing to do. So this is a really important change that's going to impact on everything from this point forward. Now you might be sitting there and thinking, all right, fine. But actually, what people think isn't always right. What people think is going on isn't always reflected by the reality of what's going on. And you would be quite right. It is worth saying that people's perceptions about crime and punishment don't always match up with the statistics that we have or the information that we have about what sort of crimes are actually happening. And that's a really important point. However, when you look at ideas and when we look at the decisions that are being made about things like, for example, law enforcement, so how do you control your population? How do you prevent crime? And also punishments and what you punish and how you punish it and why. Those are decisions that are going to be led much more by the ideas than by the reality. So ideas and perceptions and the way that people see what is going on is really, really important. It's also important to mention at this point that in 1476 we see the introduction of the first printing press in London, and it's very quickly followed by others. And as opposed to the Middle Ages, when if you wanted to write anything down, you had to do it by hand, and it took a long time and was very expensive. The printing presses mean that for the first time, people can spread their ideas by writing very quickly and very cheaply. And because more people can read, people can actually be influenced by and see those ideas. So I would call the introduction of the printing presses really the mass production of ideas. And what people write can spread and change the views of other people. And what a lot of people like to write about in the 1500s, and they produce quite a number of books and pamphlets on this, is crime. They write about crime and what they think is causing crime and what they can see happening with crime and what they think should be done about crime. And so these ideas spread much more quickly, and people get to read more people's ideas more often. That's a really important change as well. It's also worth saying that there are several instances in the 1500s of poor people and ordinary people actually presenting a threat. If we go back to the Middle Ages, before 1500, there is really one uprising. It happens in 1381, or one uprising by ordinary people. There's plenty by the nobles. But in 1381, we have something called the Peasants' Revolt. And that's the only time that ordinary people really challenge the king, and it gets squashed really easily. And nothing much happens on the back of it. Now, when we look at the 1500s, between the years 1536 and 1554 alone, there are 4 uprisings in which ordinary people really challenge the authority of the king. So there is an extent to which this is very visible, this change and this difference in the way that power is being used and challenged by people. So that's important to note as well. It's also worth saying that at this point, ordinary people are a scarier prospect because there are just more of them. I'm going to give you the figures for England and Wales, and then also just Wales by itself in case that's useful. So in 1500, the population of England and Wales together is 2.9 million. In 1550, it's 3.2 million. And in 1600, it's 4.3 million. And in Wales, that goes up from 220,000 to 250,000 in 1550 to 300,000. So the population of England and Wales grows really, really rapidly, and it nearly doubles. In fact, it does double between the years of 1550 and 1650. So the population is growing very rapidly, and that just means that there are more people. It's also worth saying as well that the perception of poor people is to some extent changing, and perceptions of poverty are changing, and there's a number of reasons for this. One, and we're going to go into a lot of detail about this later, so don't worry about it too much, but one is that after the 1530s, the Roman Catholic Church loses all of its power and all of its influence in England. And this is important because the church used to run, using its tithing money, something called almshouses, which were set up to shelter and help the poor. So that's important because they're not there anymore. As well as that, the abbeys, where the monks lived, quite often did a lot of outreach work for poor people as well and provided for them and looked after them. So after the 1530s, no Roman Catholic Church, and therefore no community support really, or much less community support for poor people. When people look at the poor, they tend to see them in 2 groups. So one group is the impotent poor. Impotent means powerless. And these were people who were seen as being powerless to look after themselves or earn a living. So there was a group of impotent poor where it's not their fault that they're poor. They can't help it. So they're old or ill for whatever reason. However, there is also an idea growing up about the able-bodied poor. And these are people who could work if they fancied it, but don't want to. And these people are seen as maybe lazy or feckless or deliberately choosing this lifestyle. And because people are starting to think in terms of the able-bodied poor and people who are choosing not to work, they're then much more reluctant to give those people money and to support them. So we lose the support of the church anyway in the 1530s. And then on top of that, people have this idea and this perception that a lot of poor people are actually choosing not to work and they're choosing to be poor. Now we're going to have a look in the next section about why people were poor and whether or not these perceptions are true. But what I'd like you to take away from this section really is this big change in who England sees as the real criminals. And I'll see you later.